Adrian Goldberg from the Byline Times. This time, chaos, confusion, and cost. Donald Trump at war, along with Israel in Iran and who knows elsewhere. Joining me to discuss where the world is at and where it might be going next, a Byline Times editor, Hardeep Matharu, and executive editor, Peter Jukes. They're just recovering from preparing the print edition of the Byline Times. It is our 7th birthday as well. 7 years of the Byline Times. Hardeep, how do you reflect on those hard 7 years?
Adrian, it has been such a journey, hasn't it? I can't believe it's been 7 years because it feels like we're in such a different world. But at the same time, it also feels like there's been a complete evolution, which has been inexplicable and chaotic in the world and what's happening around us, which it makes complete sense that this trajectory has emerged where what we're seeing now is perhaps not something we could have foreseen 7 years ago when we set Byline Times up, but sort of all the work we've been doing on looking at the deeper structural currents within politics and society and sort of how they're interacting and populism, the rise of the far right, tech, all of these forces are really, I think we see the fruition of all of them coming together in, an increasingly worrying way. But I never could have predicted it. And it's been a real, I always say this, it's been a real privilege. It really has. And I think, especially at the moment, when, as I said, things are becoming, there's even more destruction and division around the world. And it feels like everything is even more precarious. I think working on Byline Times is, on a personal note, a very good way of holding on to a sense that we can't and shouldn't retreat or give up. The world can and will be a better place. There are things that are exposed. Transparency can make a difference. We're living through a momentous time, and nothing's going to be fixed immediately. And I don't think we can go back to normal, but we can certainly make sense of it. And having some skin in the game, fighting the good fight, certainly does something for me. And I think perhaps it does something for our supporters and our readers, which is why they like, interacting and engaging with Byline Times, because I think it would be so easy right now to just be like, I don't want anything to do with what seems like a very chaotic and destructive world. But if we all do that, if we were all to do that, then I think the world would be even in an even worse state. So we can't do that. But all we can do is fight our end of the good fight. And I think that's what we've always done at Byline Times. And we've evolved from that being the Boris Johnson government and the corruptions of the British state on his watch to what is happening now. The world burns from climate change, from war, and it's really impacting people's everyday lives. So the mission remains the same. And that's what we can really do.
Byline Times, Peter, grew out of your reporting of the phone hacking scandal and the sense that you couldn't trust the mainstream media to report on itself. If that was true then, how much truer is it now? And how much truer is it that the establishment can often rely on those mainstream newspapers to uphold its dishonesty? It's very much part of the Byline ethos that we are not part of that club.
Yes, no, we started, Steve and I took over Byline.com in 2016, very much in the wake of, actually just before, but very much guided by what happened with Brexit and Trump. And then when we started up the paper, I suppose the ultimate vindication within months of our analysis, and Hardeep arrived at the same similar analysis, completely independent of me, was this political media class, which was ultimately expressed by a certain columnist called Boris Johnson becoming prime minister, and a senior minister and cabinet office, head of the cabinet office, a certain other editor called Michael Gove. And in a way, so that diagnosis that guided us the early days, I think what Hardeep's talking about is she really commented when Cadwallader spoke at a festival, I think, about 2022-3, that Carroll had foreseen this world of information warfare we're living in. And I think, to me, looking back, oh my God, obviously I was involved in the Cambridge Analytica stories, the votes leave stories, particularly the Russian interference stories. Those kind of things, they called Carol a crazy cat lady, and me, Byline Times, a conspiracist site, right? It's not a conspiracy anymore. We have Peter Thiel arriving in Rome talking about the Antichrist, having embedded himself in most defense and security software in both US and with health here. And the tech bros, that strand of Zuckerberg, Thiel, Musk, Bezos, and now Larry Ellison, I mean, they were the inauguration. In a way, that diagnosis is so writ large. Everybody goes on about it. Same with Russian interference, data operations. I think in a way, a little bit ahead of our time. And the world we feared or saw in subterfuge is coming to some massive appearance to everybody. Now, the net effect of this will go on the dark side of this, and I will just emphasize the moment of light side and hold up the previous edition, Light Out of Darkness. Now, had you told me that Jeffrey Epstein's files would contain lots of stuff about Steve Bannon running around London, Boris Johnson, and Gove and Nigel Farage trying to topple Theresa May, or that he was very close to Russian interests, or that he was very close to Peter Thiel, I go, that can't be true. What has happened is this searchlight, for me, like a flash of lightning on a darkened landscape, has exposed the powers that be. Now, when it comes to certain kinds of exposure, those too late for the survivors, the hundreds of survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, some clarity, some justice, some forewarning, foreshadowing has been fulfilled. And I think some good has come of it. Whether these other revelations about Trump, I feel, already the tide is shifting on Brexit. That was one of our major points. We're actually supposed to. Do you remember they kept on setting this date for a hard Brexit? And one of them was the 31st of March, 2019. That was our launch date. It got delayed, and then you had prorogation and all the palaver that happened after that. I feel some reckoning with the country, even though they're still supporting too many, to my mind, are supporting the guy who pushed for Brexit more than anybody else, Nigel Farage. At least when the polls come to that, I mean, people are realizing it was a mistake. It was self-damaging for whatever the loss of sovereignty we gained more. And you have people like Sadiq Khan, people always saying we should rejoin. So in some way, we did our little bit to illuminate the population, to say this is, we're conducting a trade war against ourselves. You've been lied to, Leave voters. You're not going to get more spent on the health service. You know what I mean? I think even though it's almost the moment of maximal darkness now, there is that chink of light in that people are waking up.
And part of the remit of Byline Times is to say what the papers don't say. And I know in the print edition, Hardeep, the latest print edition, we worked very hard to do that. I mean, clearly we are covering, amongst other things, the war on Iran. And it's very difficult, given the extent of the coverage through mainstream media, to find distinctive and individual things to say. But we've managed to do that, I think, very successfully in the latest print edition, not least a terrific article by Kameen Mohammadi. And Kameen is an Iranian. She doesn't live in Iran now, but she just talks about how we've had commentary in the West about people having holidays in Dubai cancelled or moved, and how inconvenient it is. So little of what we hear, and some of this is for understandable and legitimate reasons, some of it is not, about what Iranians themselves actually think about what is going on. I heard on the BBC today an interview with a senior Israeli representative talking about what the Iranians want, as if the Israeli government is the appropriate arbiter of what the Iranians want. They certainly don't want bombs raining down on them.
I think it's pronounced Kamin, but Kamin's piece really sits at the heart of this latest edition, which, I mean, as you say, Adrian, where what the papers don't say, and yet this is the global story that everybody is talking about. So what could we illuminate within that? And Kamin's piece, I'd encourage everybody to read it. It's one of those exceptional pieces of journalism where It is so memorable. It is so visceral in painting a picture, and so factual. I mean, you just learn so much from it. And yeah, Kamin, I believe at the moment resides in Italy. She and her family left Iran following the 1979 revolution. She loves her homeland, and so for her, people getting in touch or seeing these news stories about people stranded in Dubai or looking to leave, and as you say, people's holidays being disrupted. That's the country where she was born and grew up in, being bombed. And one of the things that was really striking about her piece is that she's saying that even when she was asked to appear on the BBC to offer sort of her views on what was happening, it was really striking. She called it empathy washing. So they wanted to know how she felt as an Iranian, to see what was happening to her country, and they wanted her to paint this visceral picture. And yet, for her, the key aspect of all of this is this is an illegal war. That's the words that she used, and actually, strikingly, it's not. The legality of what's happening isn't really being mentioned at all. No one is questioning that. I mean, it's hard to question anything because so many things happen so quickly every day. But for her, this is an illegal war. And she also looks back as to when this has happened before, and the cost and the price that Iranians have paid. And again, another thing that we don't really... Again, in the news cycles around conflicts all around the world, and of course there are others, we don't really hear much about the longer term impacts. So she says there's a lot of focus on almost the spectacle that Israel and the United States are creating, but less so on what happens to all those people who are living there, who are taking in fumes and toxic chemicals, and where infrastructure will take years and years to rebuild, right? What happens in the long term to those people, the diseases they develop down the line, and that sort of cost. The other striking point, which I think is really well put by Kamin, is that this has been presented as an either or. So you either have to have the regime of the Islamic regime of Iran, or you have to have war to get rid of it. And she is saying this is a false binary. Most people living in Iran have not supported the regime and how it operates. But that does not mean that they think that Israel and the United States bombing the country, which has led to all-out regional conflict in the Middle East, is the way forward. So again, it sort of gives you an insight into what this actually really means. And alongside Kamin's piece, we have Ian Overton reporting on how war has simply become content in the age of AI and influencers, which I think sits really well with Kamin's piece. How much of, especially the early days, fed into this notion of people on their iPhones sort of speculating and sort of almost getting in this voyeuristic experience, which is driven by social media, of war while real people are dying and suffering. And also a piece I commissioned Peter to write, which was looking at the iconography of destruction. So again, a lot of focus on why is the United States doing this? What are Trump's motives? Several have been given at various times by the administration, ranging from trying to free the Iranian people to nuclear weapons capability that needs to be tempered on behalf of Iran. These change and they sort of conflict, and none of it really makes much sense. Obviously, oil is another thing that many commentators have said, as well as people around Trump. But I guess Peter's piece really looks at how perhaps there is no rational, logical explanation. Trump has always been from the very beginning. He's a meme rather than a politician. And so he thrives on chaos and destruction and the spectacle. The midterms are coming up in America. Now everyone's talking about this, and for, I guess, the American public generally are not in support of the war, but for the Trumpian base, for that core supporter group, I think there is something psychological and visceral about Trump. And when he goes around saying it's America first and I'll bomb countries and make sure America's first, and then there's all the imagery of what the power this one man holds and is willing to wield. It's and so Peter's piece really looks at that, and all the time that we were going to press, Robert Duvall, the iconic actor, had died a few weeks before we went to press, maybe 3 weeks before. And I really love The Godfather, the film. It's great about immigration, very interesting. A lot of people like it, obviously. But one of Duvall's most famous roles was the consigliere to the Corleone family. And I thought Peter might be able to write something about that. And then obviously war broke out. And we were getting closer to the deadline. And I just had that kept having that famous line from Apocalypse Now, which is another Francis Ford Coppola film, which Duvall was in. And it's a really memorable line from that film. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. And it just, for me, and not to trivialize at all what's happening in the Middle East and Iran, but it was just that sense that Trump is, what is the motive beyond I love the smell of napalm in the morning? And so really, I asked Peter if he could maybe, with his film buff hat on and also just general cultural critic hat on, could we have a look at what is the iconography that I argue is more important to Trump than the realities on the ground, which Kamin speaks to very well.
Go on, Peter, pick up on that. Tell us a little bit about your article as well, because I think one of the things that a monthly publication like Byline Times can do is step back from that kind of rolling news cycle, from the doom scrolling that many of us engage in, and actually say, okay, in the midst of all this, what are the contours that we can pick out that are actually defining about this moment that will stand out in months and years to come?
I sort of look back to my own childhood. I do remember being born in 1960. I remember Kennedy's assassination. I also remember Vietnam. I remember the pictures. I think maybe you had color TV. I can't remember. We had them quite early. Was that, children fleeing napalm, the famous picture by Nick Hart. This sense of this very colorful, scary thing happening in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And it was historically, had a big impact on the peace movement. That was the first time war in color was beamed into people's homes. Now, it wasn't quite beamed when it was, but it was film, right? And just look at the change in that iconography. The Pentagon and politicians became very aware of this and very heavily curated the Gulf War of 91, the first Gulf expulsion of Saddam from Kuwait. And you had these in fact, Vaughan Smith was one of the few. He managed to smuggle himself as a former soldier to the front line and show that he runs the Frontline Club, is a great friend of Byline Times, show the missiles going over to Iraq. But you basically got, a reversion of that image with 9/11 that, bin Laden, these terrorist cells realized that war is an act of terror, it's a psychological act, as we learned in World War II, terrorizing civilian populations. But it's also in the media age, a media act. And in a way, 9/11 was the most stunning media coup. I hate to put it this way, 3,000 people died, but more people died of inhaling the smoke and particulates after it. It's very germane to what Kamin writes about and the shock and awe we see in Iraq now. It's amazing. But people are going to die. Many more people are going to continue dying because of that acid rain and all the pollution in Tehran. And then I went to shock and awe, 2003. Let's show what we can do with our fireworks, and the fiasco of Iraq in 2003. It became a fiasco, an effective invasion, no planned contingency for civil society, and a long insurrection and civil war. And in a way, Trump is a showman. He has been inculcated in the world of the 70s and 80s. He's got everything he does as a boomer, which I am too, as a kind of apprentice TV-loving boomer. And he's even used that Lieutenant Kilgore meme himself, pretending to be Robert Duvall. I love the smell of expulsions in the morning or something. So there is something I was trying to check, and I hardly commissioned it. I was a bit reluctant. How the hell am I going to make this work? But it's very important, especially if people receive politics visually. They don't pay attention to the geeky details that you, me, and Hardeep do. They see and they get a feeling. And now what's happened with this, and let's say it's a very active and maybe provocative role in all this kind of spectacle of destruction, a sense of vengeance of far and high, it is going to cause a capitalism. We may be going that later for the rest of the world. But one final thing I just add, there is a whole strain in our culture, most Abrahamic cultures, to be honest, not just Christianity, of wanting to see the end days. Apocalypse Now, it's called. I remember watching that movie in 1979 in America and just looking at those flames, completely mesmerized. And I actually was going to write a book after my first book about images of the end. Why are we intoxicated by the idea of the final struggle between good and evil and disaster movies? Because it's very exciting. Things fall apart and they become clear. But unfortunately, there is a genuine strain in American politics that really wants this to happen, that believes a Christian Zionist wing who believe that Armageddon is a hill just outside Tel Aviv, that this will lead to Armageddon, that then Christ will come. Inconveniently for the Jews, I don't think whoever support Christian Zionists realize they will be erased if they don't convert to Christianity. That has been documented, those kind of statements made to the American army. And it's also a strand, getting back to our favorite people, the bodyguards, with people like Peter Thiel, who are wandering around Europe saying the Antichrist is coming. For him, the Antichrist might be tech regulation. But people have this desire to live in the end days. I think it's kind of, sorry, just to end this rather vague thought, I've always thought, well, people want the world to end when they do, because they're so selfish. And I think Donald Trump is like this. They don't want anybody surviving them.
That's a pretty chilling thought, Peter. Hardy, I'm just thinking as well about the role of the media and how important the media is, and why suppression of images, suppression of news is so important. So that we saw in Gaza, for example, where Western journalists are not permitted to operate. We saw the killing of tens of thousands of civilians by the IDF, but deaths which were not able to be documented adequately and properly. And by the time that images do emerge, the moment the news cycle has moved on. And in a different way, in Iran, because of the suppression of the Iranian government, with which, of course, nobody on Byline Times holds any love for the Iranian government. But the nature of that government means that images of the deaths of these potentially 160, 170 schoolgirls, for example, who were killed in one of the early strikes, by the time we have the picture evidence of that, the news cycle again has moved on. So I suppose that just underlines how important it is to keep getting at the truth and not just to be sucked into the immediate news cycle as well.
I think
No, Peter, please.
I'm just going to say, I want you to follow up, Hardy. I mean, it's slightly changed. Obviously, they're suppressing the internet in Iran as they were in Russia. And the sort of answer, and certainly in places like Ukraine and Palestinian independent media, Palestinian media, mainstream broadcasters won't often publish them because they're not seen to be independent. But we did have documentation. And with everybody having a camera in their hand, I think there is more chance for the news getting out, except when obviously authorities cotton onto it like Iranians did, and they are in Russia. And we must be careful. Yeah, I mean, just on this Iranian thing, nobody said Saddam Hussein was a good person. But that doesn't mean the way the Americans invaded, and particularly the way they planned for the peace, was a good thing, or good for Iranians, or good for the world.
I think the other thing about I think absolutely what you say about not just getting sucked into the news cycle. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday and just observing how I already feel. I mean, I feel it, but maybe this is the work we do, that I already can sense just after a few weeks how normalized the war, this latest war, has now become in all around us. It's just now happening. It continues on. And again, it's extraordinary. Like, there are so many different factors. We've touched on many of them many times about why that is, and a lot of it is to do with the media. I mean, one of the striking things from the UK perspective in terms of the media, and this comes back right back to the start of the conversation about why Byline Times exists, and that media political class and its merger, and the private interests that are served by that as opposed to the public interest, is sort of, Keir Starmer. In a way, it's a really defining moment for Keir Starmer's government, in that anything else we can say about it, it's been quite definitive that we're not going to do what the Blair government did, and we're not going to follow the United States into this conflict beyond what we really need to do in terms of access to bases and stuff. And that's been really interesting because both the Conservatives and Reform UK, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, began by saying that we should be going in after the United States. They've subsequently rode back from that position, kind of modified it and gone back and forth. Not entirely clear what it is that they're advocating for. But certainly what's striking is recent polls have already shown that the UK public at large don't want to go into a war, and that's what Keir Starmer seems to be picking up on. I'm not privy to his actual decision making, but I'm sure he does. He probably is trying to learn a lesson from those days of Iraq. And Tony Blair and what came to so define Blair's legacy. And of course, Blair is now the figure popping up in public life saying to Keir Starmer that we should be joining the United States. So that's incredible. But anyway, but in terms of Starmer, the question is why Kemi Badenoch and Farage must be seeing these polls as well. And I'm not somebody who goes by polls. I'm not saying that, but they must be seeing those and learning the lessons of Iraq. You'd think they would instinctively be saying, yes, this isn't something we should get too militarily involved in. It's just not what the British people would want us to do. But they're not. They're flip-flopping around, but they are saying we should be following the United States in. And I guess there's no analysis of what is that disparity, because then why are they advocating this policy? In whose in the public interest? But again, that's just another example of a story where the media, and so of course there are many media outlets on the right are also taking that same stance as Badenoch and Farage, and therefore they're not going to scrutinize the very thing I'm highlighting. But then the question once again becomes, like, even in a big story like this, what explains that disparity? And no one's really analyzing that. And I think it's striking, actually. I think actually in this case, Starmer is instinctively going with what the public will want.
Well, I'm pretty sure that he is responding to the lessons of Iraq, and I think it's quite amusing if it were not so serious that the same newspapers that would berate Blair for his support of George W. in the Iraq War, a disastrous war in which tens of thousands of people died, in which horrendous sectarian hatred was stirred up. Those same papers who would condemn Blair for backing that war are now urging Starmer to back the United States in what appears to be a very similar war. They really do want to have their cake and eat it.
Well, they're constantly having new cakes and eating them. And I remember the build-up. I mean, Hardy was probably quite young at the time. I was in my early 40s. And I actually know some people in America in the White House and things like that. And the two things was, all those papers were drumming. The dodgy dossier, whatever you say about the intelligence report, which was fed to Blair and Campbell, and particularly through the Rumsfeld Department of Defense. The observer in those days would just type out, "Oh, we've got to go to war." There's a government line on it without question. It's only after we've lost Adrian briefly. We'll just keep on talking. It's only after Hardeep. When it turned out to be a fiasco, they all berated Blair for it. At the time, they were all praising him. And, likewise, if this goes, which it is already going, a complete fiasco, worse than a fiasco, because this is an egregious error, isn't it? It's not. At East Iraq, there was a rationale, was some kind of a plan. With Iran, there seems to be absolutely no plan at all. I mean, Trump's surprised, and he's back, thank God. I'm just carrying on your absence, Adrian. I was just saying how, whatever you think about Iraq, there was a plan. It was an ill-formulated plan. They got weapons of mass destruction wrong, and they admitted it when they got it wrong. They had false intelligence loop, which was became an echo chamber, and they said they got it wrong. They never faked it. With Trump, we're in a whole new world of irrationality and disorder. And if those papers are supported, and 50% of the population on the eve of war supported it, the invasion of Iraq, partly because British troops are in action and there've been such a powerful propaganda about them having weapons of mass destruction, they did support it. But, if they can't remember they supported it, didn't then, they will not remember that they have supported Trump now and don't. And at some point, and there are various reasons for that, by the way, all these media organizations trying to move to America, trying to please Trump. They want to get him interviewed, like GB News has done. But at some point, after Brexit, after this, after all the Russian stuff, the audience is going to wake up and saying, you guys have lied to us again.
There's going to be, though, a fallout for the UK economy, which is going to hit Starmer. And I'd suggest that the lesson of history is that even as petrol prices rise, even then as food prices rise as a result of that, the public may well acknowledge that Starmer is right not to throw his full support behind Donald Trump. But again, I'd suggest the evidence is that historically, they'll also kick Starmer and the Labour government for the rising cost of living, which is not his fault, which is directly attributable to Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu.
It's an interesting, the other current alongside all of this, which we also pick up in this latest print edition with our analysis of the Gorton and Denton by-election, is we are in such a momentous period, Adrian, because effectively, I mean, the May elections, local elections are coming up, so that will paint more of a picture. But the historic win of the Green Party in Gorton and Denton, it just, and following on the Caerphilly by-election last year in Wales, which Plaid Cymru won, I think the two-party system, in its last days. It's in its last days. And again, when we started 7 years ago, when we had those Conservative governments, all those prime ministers, who would have thought that the Conservative Party, this sort of historic party of government in Europe, it just completely, it's decimated. And it'll be interesting to see whether that is on its way for Labour. But I think what we can say is all of these big tectonic plates, which are, moving and causing these, fractious sort of elements. One of those shifting tectonics is politics itself. I think the two-party system that we've seen here in the UK is on its way out. Then the question becomes, what are the alternatives that people are looking for? And it is one of those alternatives, sort of a party like Nigel Farage's. Of course, Farage advocating that we should be more into the war, which he has subsequently rode back from. But again, as you say, the intricacies are lost when it comes to elections down the line. So, there's many things shifting in many different ways, and it would be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, worth listening. Sorry, I was going to say, Pete, if you haven't heard the previous podcast to this one, where I interview Andy Street, who was the former West Midlands, he, along with the former Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, have launched this Conservative pressure group called Prosper UK, very much arguing for a one-nation version of conservatism rather than one like Kemi Badenoch's, which is tacked to the right, arguing for the centre ground, arguing that no Conservative government has ever come to power without in some way harnessing the power of the middle ground. But we're in a moment, aren't we, where Kemi Badenoch has tacked right, Sir Keir Starmer has tacked right, and the whole Overton window has moved ever to the right. Yet the consequence of that has been Brexit, which has demonstrably damaged the UK economy, and this certainly until recently, this kind of almost worshipping of Trump by the right. Well, surely that cannot sustain, that cannot endure when we're seeing what we're seeing every night on our TV screens and on our mobile phones.
Adrian, I'm just very upset you think I didn't listen to that last podcast. I spend every night cuddling my iPhone listening to your podcast.
Good.
They send me to sleep immediately. No, that is very so podcasts do tend to send me to sleep, not yours. Yeah, I think, you know what, this is Donald Trump blowing himself up. I can see no other way around this. I'll tell you why in a moment. And anybody who has hitched their wagon train to him, including Nigel Farage, is going to have a very, very, very difficult time. The long-term consequence, well, let's go for that. I mean, the thing is, what we're facing is something like the 1970s. If oil goes up to $150 a barrel, which it will do if just the Straits of Hormuz are cut off, bear in mind, helium and thought circuitry and and phosphates for fertilizer go through this Gulf Strait of Hormuz too.
Which will also, with their absence, will be part of that calculation of pushing up food prices.
Exactly. Transport prices will go up. I'm friends who live in the countryside. Their oil deliveries have got doubled in 2 weeks. The price. That's going to have a massive global impact. That's if the Straits of Hormuz are closed. That means $150 dollars a barrel, oil at $150 a barrel, probably knocks 2 to 3% off the world economy, causes a recession and inflation. You get stagflation. If, as they seem to be doing, there is a trade of destruction of Iranian installations and other Gulf installations which pump out to the Red Sea, and you may have got the Houthis there, you got $250 a barrel. That is the world economy, a recession of 5%. So we are facing a crisis, thanks to Donald Trump, completely uninformed, no plan, didn't realize to close the Straits of Hormuz, didn't realize you can't protect shipping there because they can't defend their own warships against a 500-mile coast of Iran and small drones, that will redound on his head in history forever, right? And we're going to pay the price. I'm upset at thinking people are going to be impoverished, right? But on the other hand, I would say we went through a worse crisis 6 years ago with COVID. If people pull together, if there isn't a beggar my neighbor, if we're all in it together, I mean, that's every nation. America doesn't import much oil, but China, Japan, they have these massive oil reserves to cope with this. Europe, it will speed up, but not in time to reduce prices, renewables. But I think in that kind of crisis where we're all together, it can't be beggar thy neighbor, there may be a room for kind of like a COVID response where we were paid to sit at home, The economy didn't. It bounced back. Of course, it collapsed. It bounced back. But let's not underestimate how severe the impact of this is. Some of those installations they've recently bombed, like yesterday, will take 5 or 6 years to rebuild. So that is a permanent crisis. But because, unlike Brexit, that piggyback, we're going to do better than them, or we don't care about them. I think there's a chance for people. My final thought about Starmer electoral politics is this, right? Of course, they're going to get wiped out in the May elections. But there's a thing beyond the polls and sort of politics du jour and the kind of who's up, who's down, the greasy pot, is administration. Now, do you believe that Boris Johnson, we did okay in some ways during COVID, was the good person to be there in that crisis? I would say, personal opinion from what I've seen, no. And that people died who didn't need to die. But do I trust that Labour is their competence in the administration with Starmer and his cabinet and people like Ed Miliband? I'd say, well, better than anybody else. And even if they get wiped out in 3 years' time, my immediate fear of the administration of government, the direction of the country travels, its ability to cooperate with other countries, is I feel we're in a much, much better position we were in 2020 when COVID hit.
Hardip, I just want to finish this episode by remembering our colleague Paul Conroy, the great war photographer. He was Mary Colvin's colleague on the Sunday Times when she lost her life in Syria. I only interviewed him a couple of times for this podcast when he was working with Zarina Zabriskie in Ukraine, and reading the obits, I've really enjoyed my conversations with him. I wish I'd known him better.
To be honest, Adrian, I share that sentiment. I only met him once or twice myself. Peter is probably the best to have the last word on this, so I'll hand over to Peter. But the pages that are dedicated to Paul, both in remembrance of him by John Sweeney in this edition, and also his last photo essay that Paul did for us in Cuba. He died, I think, just 2 days after returning with those photographs and that piece of writing that he did. They're some of the most beautiful pages we've ever published in the print edition. They're really worth taking the time to really look at those beautiful photos, and it just speaks for itself, bearing witness. But Peter, you were in contact with Paul Conroy just in the last 24 hours before he suddenly died.
I was only his tech message. I last saw him in the flesh in Kyiv in winter. I don't, it upsets me, but he was so full of life. It's just impossible. He's indestructible. I mean, he had half his leg blown off. He was told to have it amputated when he was in Homs. They got him and Mary Colvin went through a sewer on a motorbike to get there. Russians tagged them on a sat nav. And he tells me this, her, and I forget the others, forgive me, the name of the other journalist with him. He was kind of, their fixer. And they started bombing the house where they were staying. And Paul said, "Don't run." And she ran. And he tried to run after, and he's fortunately just protected by a wall, just got his leg. And it reminds me of a very funny moment. It's actually on film when Paul was a fixer on that film that Caden Robinson did for us with John Sweeney, Under Deadly Skies, which the first year of the war. And there's a bit, I think, then Kramatorsk, and there's some fragmentation bombs over. So, you hear a vague explosion and Caden's like, "Am I going to die? Am I going to die?" "No, Caden," he's on his face. "You're not going to die. I can't really do Liverpool. I'm doing Yorkshire instead." But he's had this thing. He's always, I won't try to attempt his lovely Liverpudlian accent, but he would say, never, and somebody else was running. I think Serena was running. "Don't get up and run when a bomb. When you hear that, you're much safer on the ground." And when I was in Ukraine the year before last, I went with him to Hessel, to the front line. The city is now being decimated. He told this amazing thing, because we did see outgoing, and we discussed, whether you're on the front line, all this kind of stuff, which, battle-weary veteran war photographers would love to talk about. He said, "Peter, you know what the best thing to do if somebody throws a grenade at you? You wouldn't think. Lie down and face it." What he said was, if you go lie back, right, it's going to get all the soft parts of your body, right? It's going to kill you. But if you lie down and put your hands on your head, your skull's really hard, and you stand a much better chance. So I always think that Paul faced the grenade.
Well, there's a beautiful final essay from him, as you say, hard deep in the latest print edition of the Byline Times. Do look out for it on your newsstands, or better still, take out a subscription. The best place to get a subscription, in fact, the only place to take out a subscription, is over at our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's at bylinetimes.com. And if you do take out a subscription, you're supporting this podcast as well. So thank you, Hardeep. Well done. Congratulations on 7 years. Well done, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for listening to this edition of the Byline Times podcast here live on Substack. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.